Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Northern California chapter webinar on recent major earthquakes in the South Pacific Ocean. I'm Maggie Ortiz-Milan, Program Manager at EERI. Today's webinar is being recorded, and information about how to access the recording will be provided in a follow-up email. For those who may not be familiar, I want to say a few words about EERI before handing things over to today's moderators. The Earthquake Engineering Research Institute is the leading nonprofit membership association connecting those dedicated to reducing earthquake risk. EERI has been bringing people and disciplines together since 1948. By joining EERI, you become a member of our global network of multidisciplinary professionals dedicated to reducing earthquake risk. Now I'll turn it over to Volkan Seviljan, the president of the EERI Northern California chapter, to let you know more about the chapter.
Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome you on behalf of our chapter and on behalf of Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. We are delighted to have wonderful speakers today, and we'll learn a lot about tsunamis. And I would like to talk to you about our chapter. Our chapter is dedicated to reducing earthquake risks in Northern California. However, this year, due to COVID, we are expanding, and now we are covering earthquakes around the globe to learn from them and trigger collaboration between scientists all around the globe. I urge you to join our chapter. Our website's eerinc.org. You can look at our mail list, and you can learn about these events, and as we are going to organize more of these in the coming weeks. So now I would like to introduce you Bruce Meeson, who is our secretary and treasurer, and who's been instrumental of getting this event ready for us. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Volkan. I'd like to welcome everyone to our briefing today. My name is Bruce Meeson. I am also a board member of the Northern California chapter. I am very excited about today's briefing, for it deals with tsunamis, a subject that very few of us are familiar with. So I expect to learn quite a lot from the two speakers we're having today. But before I get into it, I want to mention a future briefing that we're already planning for May. Earlier this year, March 3rd, there was a major earthquake struck central part of Greece. It was a magnitude 6.2. It was the most intense shaking in that region for over 250 years. We will be having two speakers talk about that event. The first will deal with the geotechnical and seismological aspects, and the second will be with regard to the building damage and emergency response. So this will be another very interesting presentation. So please stay tuned. Expect to see an announcement from us later on this month. Now back to today's meeting. In the first week of March, 3 major earthquakes struck in the Pacific Ocean northeast of New Zealand. One of the events was a magnitude 8.1. Earthquakes of this magnitude can generate tsunamis, that is, ocean waves, that can be devastating to communities thousands of miles away. Fortunately, this event did not cause large ocean waves. But nevertheless, we want to give a briefing about the seismological aspects as well as tsunamis in general. We have two speakers today. The first is a William Power, and he is joining us from New Zealand, where it is early morning New Zealand time. He will be giving us a New Zealand perspective on these earthquakes. And then our second speaker is a Rick Wilson, who is joining us from Sacramento, California. He will tell us about the tsunami hazards that we face in coastal California. Here's how our presentations are going to work today. Each speaker will talk for about 20 minutes. Then we've allotted about 20 minutes for question and answers from the audience. You, the audience, will pose your questions using the Q&A button. You'll see it on the bottom of your screen. It's like a chat button, and you'll type in your questions. Then behind the scenes, Vulcan will be reviewing these questions. Then later on in the meeting today, he will pose those questions to the speakers. Now, we recognize that we might have more questions than time allows. Both of our speakers today have kindly provided their email, so you can be able to email them directly with questions, with the caveat that they are under no obligation to answer all questions. And the reason is they're very busy. And if they get like 100 questions, they're not going to be able to answer them all. However, we anticipate they should be able to answer some of your questions if we cannot cover them today near the end of our session. Now, what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker, William Power. He is with GNS Science. This is a government-owned research institute in New Zealand. He undertakes tsunami research to evaluate the threats as well as possible mitigations that tsunami poses for New Zealand. He also participates in the Tsunami Experts Panel that provides advice to the New Zealand government on possible policy programs that they would instigate. I would like to warmly welcome William Powell. William Powell, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Bruce. Let me now share my screen. Okay, can you confirm that you're seeing my screen?
Don't see it.
No, okay.
I do see it.
How about now?
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to talk, well, thank you for the kind introduction, Bruce. I'm going to talk about the recent major earthquakes in the South Pacific Ocean and present it from a New Zealand perspective, because I'm part of the Tsunami Expert Panel for New Zealand, and one of our roles is to advise the government during a tsunami about how to respond. So I was part of the response to these recent events, and I'll therefore sort of present things from that perspective. So here's a diagram showing these four events that we had within a 3-week period in the Southwest Pacific. So the first was on the 11th of February. We had a magnitude 7.7 earthquake on the New Hebrides, southern part of the New Hebrides Trench. And then about 3 weeks later, on the 5th of March, these are New Zealand dates and times, we had a series of 3 tsunamigenic earthquakes within the space of a few hours. So the first was a magnitude 7.3, close to the East Cape of New Zealand. And the second, magnitude 7.4, near Raoul Island. And the third and largest on that day, it was magnitude 8.1, also near Raoul Island. And this is along the Tonga-Kermadec Trench. All of these are along the Tonga-Kermadec Trench, which is a subduction plate boundary between the Pacific tectonic plate and the Australian tectonic plate. And it's very, very unusual for us to have so many earthquakes and capable of producing tsunamis in such a short space of time. So in a normal year, we might be responding to 1 or maybe 2 tsunamis. So to have 4 in the space of 3 weeks, and indeed 3 within 1 day, was very unusual for us. Now, also on this diagram, we put in a few of our monitoring instruments. So the red dots are our dart buoys, or the locations for our dart buoys. These are instruments that sit in the deep ocean, and they measure the tsunamis passing over them by measuring the pressure. So as a tsunami wave goes over these it increases the pressure that the sensor on the seafloor measures, and we can use that to detect the presence of tsunamis and measure the size of waves. Now, the New Zealand DART network is in the process of being installed, so we only had the ones that are with solid dots were installed and operating at the time of these earthquakes. These 4 are not yet installed, and these 2 were installed but not operating correctly yet. In addition, there are various tide gauges around New Zealand and around the islands of Southwest Pacific that we saw these tsunamis on. And of course, it's very much an open question. Why do we get this kind of clustering of earthquakes? Why do we have this period of several major events? The 2 around Raoul Island we can view as being, foreshock and main shock, but these other events several hundred kilometers away. So we have the question, what is it that is causing this cluster to occur? So now I'm just going to go a little bit into the basics of how a tsunami is generated by an earthquake, which may be well known to some of you already. So the essential process for most tsunamis are generated by earthquakes, and most of the tsunamis are generated by earthquakes on subduction plate boundaries. So subduction plate boundary, we have one tectonic plate passing underneath another. And at times, those tectonic plate boundaries get stuck together. So, in some locations, in some periods, the plates can move smoothly past each other, but sometimes they get stuck together. And when that happens, we have deformation of the overriding plate and storage of elastic energy. And at a certain point, that the friction holding the 2 plates together is overcome. The elastic energy is released and the plate springs back, and that causes a movement of the seafloor, and that is raising up the water above it. And that becomes the initiation of the tsunami. So from that point on, the water spreads out away from its initial place where it was lifted or raised or lowered from the seafloor, and waves travel off. And though the part of the wave that is traveling towards land, it gets larger as it moves closer to the shore. So the tsunami wave in deep water may only be a few tens of centimeters, but still could be meters by the time it gets to the coast. An important distinction between tsunami waves and the usual kind of wind waves on the sea is that the waves last for much longer. So we're talking about a wave that goes on for tens of minutes rather than a wind wave, which would normally last for tens of seconds. And this long duration is part of what enables the tsunami to inundate much further inland than normal wind waves, because the wind waves, no sooner have they started coming in than they start coming back out again, but the tsunami will last for a lot longer. So bearing in mind that the tsunamis are the majority generated on these subduction plate interfaces, we can look around the Pacific and we can see that there is this sort of ring of subduction plate boundaries all around the edge of the Pacific. And local to New Zealand, the plate boundary actually passes through our country. So to the north, we have this Tonga-Kermadec Trench, which becomes the Hikurangi subduction zone. Then the plate boundary passes overland along the Alpine Fault, and then becomes the Pusiga plate boundary to our south. And you can see this is an example where up on the Kermadec Trench, we have the Pacific plate being pushed down underneath the Australian plate, but down in Pusiga, we have the reverse process. So the Australian plate is being pushed down beneath the Pacific plate. And specifically close to New Zealand, we also have areas where we can have landslides, submarine landslides, which are another way to cause tsunamis, but a less common mechanism. There are also in the South Pacific many volcanoes, some submarine, some just poking above the water, and these could be also tsunamigenic. But these are certainly much more rare than tsunamis generated by earthquakes. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we monitor and forecast and issue warnings in the event of a tsunami. So the trigger for the tsunami forecasting and warning process can come either from PTWC, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, who will issue messages when there's a large earthquake that is potentially tsunamigenic, or if it's close to New Zealand, the initiation of the warning process may come from our National Geohazards Monitoring Center. So at the NGMC, as we call it, we have people who are on duty 24/7, monitoring for earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, and volcanoes, using our local network. So if any of these things happen close to New Zealand, they may be the first to spot it. If it's happening further away, it will probably be PTWC who get the ball rolling for us. And the process is divided between what's called the National Emergency Management Agency, which is a civil defense authority, and they are responsible for the issuing of warnings. And they work in correspondence with GNS Science, and we are the ones who are essentially providing the forecast on which the warning is based. So there's a distinction between the forecast, which is a sort of scientific process, and the warning part, which is more about getting messages out to people. And within GNS Science, the people who contribute to making the forecast, we have the officers in the National Geohazards Monitoring Center. There's a seismic duty officer who is sort of on call at short notice to respond to any earthquakes. And there's what we call the Tsunami Experts Panel, which is a group of people who specialize in tsunamis, who are paged in the event of an event that needs to be analyzed. So we use the information available to us to produce forecasts, pass these to the civil defense authorities, and they disseminate these to both to the public and to various organizations that have to respond. Amongst the dissemination methods, we have emergency mobile alerts. So these are messages that go straight through to people's mobile phones to warn them if there's a tsunami or other natural hazard in their area. Now, there are various tools that we use to produce a tsunami forecast, but the most established one, and possibly the simplest one for us to use, is what we call a Tsunami Scenario Database. So what this is we have run a large number, several hundred scenario events based on earthquakes around the Pacific. We have modeled the propagation of the tsunamis from those events and put them together into a database. And then when an earthquake happens around the Pacific, we can go through the database, pull out the most similar event in the catalog, and use that as the basis for the tsunami forecast. And the format of our forecast is like as shown in this figure here. So we have the coast divided up into a number of warning zones, and we choose we allocate a tsunami threat level based on the maximum height of tsunami we expect at the coast within each zone, which is color coded. And it's these maps that the Tsunami Expert Panel issues and passes on to the civil defense to use as the basis for setting up any evacuations or public messages. At the local level, most of our communities have tsunami evacuation maps, which are drawn to as a national standard. They're usually 3-colored maps. So we have a red zone, an orange zone, and a yellow zone. If the tsunami is from far enough afield and we have good time to prepare a forecast, we can, if we're confident, sort of decide how many of these zones we need to evacuate based on the size of tsunami we're anticipating. So if it's a small event, we may say it's only necessary to evacuate the red zone. If it's medium size, we may say we need to evacuate the orange and red zone. And if it's a big one, we say we have to evacuate the yellow, orange, and red zones. Now, the exception to this is if the earthquake is close to New Zealand and we have the message that long or strong get gone, which means if you feel a long duration earthquake or a strongly felt earthquake, strong here being strong enough that it's difficult to stand up or walk around, then people should self-evacuate immediately without waiting to be told. And in that case, we are asking people to evacuate from all of the zones. So there's red, orange, and yellow. That's just because the tsunami source is very close to our coastal places, and they could arrive within a few minutes. And we want people to start evacuating straight away when they feel that strong earthquake, just to give the maximum time to be able to get out of the evacuation zones. Now, I talked about the threat level forecast. There is something of a special case where if the tsunami is, or if the earthquake is close to New Zealand, we can also issue these, what we call initial advice land threat maps. So these are something that the people in the Geohazards Monitoring Center can issue without having to wait to get the advice from Tsunami Expert Panel. They are based on pre-established criteria of which zones must be evacuated given a nearby earthquake. So it's based on the magnitude and the distance. We produce these maps to very quickly get people evacuating if it's nearby. And the wording is carefully done so that if it's these areas where it's under immediate threat, that says, please evacuate straight away. And these other areas, it's under assessment. And we say, if you felt long or strong earthquake, please still evacuate even in these zones. So we never sort of contradict that long or strong get gone message. So now I've come a little bit to the story behind what happened in these particular recent events. So the first was this Loyalty Islands event. So this is the one near the New Hebrides Trench in February. So our initial messages in this case came from PTWC because this is outside the range of our local networks. So initial magnitudes at 7.9, later revised to 7.7. From this location on the New Hebrides Trench, the tsunami energy gets divided, with some heading north and some concentrated towards the south, coming towards New Zealand. And in this case, we produced our initial forecast maps using the PTWC information that they had provided. We observed the tsunami on several of our tide gauges. So this is North Cape in the far north, Great Barrier Island and East Cape. And this is the kind of signal we would see on the tide gauges. You can see at Great Barrier Island, this reached about 65 centimeters or so in amplitude. One thing we have to note here is that a tide gauge is only measuring one particular point on the coast. And the size of tsunami, particularly on an irregular coast like most of New Zealand's coast, varies quite a lot spatially. So the fact that we were getting 60 centimeters or so at the tide gauge, we may well have been getting up to about a meter in other places nearby. So moving on to the day when we had the three earthquakes, one after the other. So the first was near what we call the East Cape. So this is close to the coast of New Zealand. So we first observed this on our seismic network. We also received messages from PTWC. Because it was close, we went straight to issuing this initial advice threat map. So these are telling people to evacuate in these areas. And then after time, as we got more information, we issued this, a threat level map like the one on the right. And in this case, we could see the tsunami clearly on our dart buoys. Now, the nearest dart buoy C, is actually rather close to the earthquake. And that requires some processing, because if your pressure sensor is close to the earthquake, it also is affected by Rayleigh waves that move the sensor up and down on the seafloor, and acoustic pressure waves generated by the earthquake as well. So there's quite a bit of noise if you're close to the earthquake, and it takes some time before you can filter out and start to clearly see the tsunami signal. Again, we could also see this on our other gauges a bit further away, and at our tide gauges on the coast. So now come to the middle event on that particular day, which we would view in hindsight as a foreshock. So that was magnitude 7.3 near Raoul Island. We saw that observed this on Raoul Island tide gauges, and it looks like a fairly straightforward thrust event. That first event, we only had one section of coast, which according to our modeling was in what we call the marine threat level. So that's between 0.3 and 1 meter expected maximum tsunami height within this area of coast. So this was on its own a relatively minor event, but of course it occurred as we were still finishing off with dealing with that first event. And then before this one had finished, we got the main shock from the Raoul Island, which was magnitude 8.1. So this is on the Kermadec Trench, and you can see the energy is being, the larger part is going perpendicular to the trench. So some of it coming out into the South Pacific, and another part that's heading out sort of northwest out towards New Caledonia, Vanuatu, Fiji, and some of that coming also down towards the New Zealand coast. So again, we in this case issued this initial advice land threat map. So these areas people were asked to evacuate immediately. And through time, this was refined to produce this threat level map. So the green areas are marine threat areas. So this is where we advise people to keep off the beach and out of marinas. And this pale blue is in this threat level 1 to 3 meters. And that's the, a level where we would expect, where we ask people to start leaving from the evacuation zones. Again, we recorded this on several of our dart buoys and also on our tide gauges. Unfortunately, the earthquake being close to Raoul Island, it damaged the communications center at Raoul Island, so we couldn't get the tide gauge information from the tide gauges on Raoul Island, which was unfortunate. Nonetheless, the dart buoys, that was able to sort of confirm our forecast and check that we were in the right ballpark of the size of tsunami we were anticipating. Now I'd like to show a couple of videos briefly. So the first one here. Now these are YouTube videos. This one has been issued by the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center and is showing some of their modeling. Now the unique thing about the modeling they've done here is that they are superimposing, they're showing the 3 different earthquakes on the same day, all on the same model. So there's our first earthquake around East Cape. And while that is still propagating, the second earthquake will occur. There's the second earthquake. And while the waves from that are still propagating, comes the third and largest earthquake and tsunami. So it's a very unusual situation. The tsunamis are still kind of resonating around our coast, one after the other. And it's no longer, we can't fully treat these as separated events. The waves are coming in on top of each other. Now this model is showing, at a big scale, the propagation of the tsunami. We can also bring this type of modeling down where to look at much finer details. And if it's a big enough event, we can, or a large hypothetical event, we can bring this in to look at the inundation at the coast. And it's by looking at hypothetical earthquakes and the inundation that they can occur in models like this that's behind a lot of our evacuation maps, and is increasingly behind the sort of push for more engineering solutions to mitigate tsunami risks. Okay, let me stop that one. And bring another one. So this was recorded by a member of the public, and that this is a accelerated time recording or from one of the bays on the northeast coast of New Zealand. And we're going to see here the tsunami waves coming into this estuary. So this is speeded up. So every second is about 1 minute. So it's sped up something like 60 times. And now we can see the sort of pulses of tsunami coming in to the estuary. Perhaps every sort of 5 to 10 minutes, another pulse of the tsunami wave comes through. This is fairly typical of what was actually seen, mostly from the largest of these 3 events. That largest event occurred during daytime, and fortunately, people were evacuated, but it was a nice sunny day. And these are relatively unpopulated parts of New Zealand, so people were moved up onto the hills, and from a distance, many of them could see these water fluctuations coming in and out. As it stands, there was relatively little inundation that occurred above the sort of level of a high tide. There was a small amount, but not a lot. So we can view in hindsight the evacuation as precautionary, but given the uncertainty involved, I think most people would agree being cautious is the right thing to do. And yes, that's all I have for my presentation today. My email address is there, and as Bruce mentioned, if there are questions unanswered, feel free to email me. And I'd like to also acknowledge my colleagues who contributed to preparing this talk and the results presented within it.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, William. I'd like to move immediately to our second speaker. We're running a little bit long, but we'll be able to get him in. Our second speaker today is Rick Wilson. He's with the California Geological Survey. He serves as the Tsunami Unit Manager. He also co-chairs the Tsunami Science and Technology Advisory Board that advises our national government. He does this through the NOAA organization, and any questions that Congress may have on tsunamis would actually go through this advisory panel. So let's warmly welcome Rick Wilson. Rick Wilson, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. I'll make sure everybody can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, terrific. All righty. So thank you for the invitation to speak today about tsunami hazards and how they impact California. Tsunamis are one of those low probability events, but they have a high potential for impact that sometimes they don't get a lot of attention. So it's good that I appreciate your interest in this topic. As I've shown on here on the right, we have a lot of different partners we work with at the state and federal government and academic institutions, as well as private companies that help us with our work at the state level. Our primary partner at CGS is the California Office of Emergency Services. We work on a daily basis with that group, and it's really a team effort that I'm going to talk about here today. I also wanted to briefly discuss why this is important. In 2013, we worked with the USGS on the Science Application for Risk Reduction project, which looked at the impacts of a large tsunami scenario on California. And from that work, it was estimated that by improving various parts of the tsunami planning cycle here you see, or the disaster planning cycle, you could greatly reduce the number of casualties and damage by up to 80 to 90%. And that's a terrific number that you can shoot for. And this really is our incentive for doing the work we do, knowing that we can have that much impact. And I'll loop back around to parts of this disaster planning cycle later in the talk. So I thought I'd follow William's great talk on the Kermadec events by our own experience of what happened from the Kermadec Islands earthquake, the magnitude 8.1 that happened in that cycle. One of CGS's roles during a tsunami like this, or potential tsunami event, is to advise and support Cal OES as well as local governments on their response activities. And the earthquake occurred, for us, it was about 11:29 a.m. in California. And within 11 minutes, the National Tsunami Warning Center came out with their first information statement, which stated that they were analyzing the event to determine the level of danger for their area of responsibility, which includes California. This is a very typical message for the Warning Center as they pull together information from their deep ocean buoy system. However, one of the issues with this is that for the first several hours, that leaves the local emergency managers and officials on edge about what actions to take. So we try to fill in some of that time gap with by providing information that we know about the event and kind of talk to them about what we think the event means for California. Will it cause a significant tsunami? And in this case, based on the size and location and the depth of the earthquake, we didn't think that it would rise to the level of a tsunami advisory or a tsunami warning for California's coast. So we think, we made that note that this is what we felt. However, we also indicated that things could change and that the Warning Center had the ultimate say on that final threat level. So 3 hours after the earthquake, the Warning Center confirmed that there was no tsunami threat for California. And although local communities really appreciated the information we provided in the interim, we're really trying to work with the Warning Center to provide some information during that time that indicates what they think will happen, as opposed to what their final say will be. And it puts them in a tough spot, but I think it's very useful information for locals. And 11 to 12 hours later, we did see the tsunami arrive along our coast, and tide gauges did record a very small tsunami. It got up to about 10 centimeters. And some of the tide gauges, you can see the tide gauge at the bottom there for Port San Luis. Now, William went through some of this and really not knowing, the background of everybody that's taking part in the webinar today, I thought I'd just kind of reiterate some of this information about tsunami hazards, what a tsunami is, and so forth. And we can really call this, from my slides, California Tsunami 101 if you want. So what is a tsunami? And tsunami waves, as William mentioned, are different than wind waves primarily because of their wavelength. Wind waves have this very short wavelength, or rather kind of wave period that only lasts 8 to 20 seconds on average. That reduces that potential for them to build up and inundate land. Tsunamis, on the other hand, have wave periods on the order of 10 to 20 minutes and sometimes longer. And this can allow them to build up offshore as they get into the shallow area. And over time, they can kind of amplify on top of each other, and inundation can occur. And for especially large tsunamis, it's almost like taking the shoreline and taking the land and dipping it onshore and offshore every 10 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes. So that's kind of how you can picture what's happening there. They can last for a very long time, and usually the first surge is not the longest. And this is a really important message we try to get out to the public. And William also talked about some of the different types of causes of tsunamis. And this is a good illustration, just as he had, showing what a fault can do on the submarine fault. And so like you mentioned, subduction zones are these types of submarine faults that have the potential for displacing the seafloor. And once that seafloor is displaced during an earthquake, the surface of the water mimics that seafloor displacement, and a mound occurs at the surface, and then it moves away from that central location due to gravity. And this usually happens about 80–90% of the time that we have faults that generate tsunamis. He also mentioned that landslides could occur, and this is a good illustration of what a landslide-induced tsunami might look like. Again, it displaces the seafloor. It could either come from on land or off in the submarine environment. But once it displaces the water column, and it could produce a mound at the surface or some kind of basin, that water moves away from that location in all directions due to gravity. And these typically don't have as much impact because of the amount of land that's been displaced. They typically only have a range of about 30 to 50 miles along the coast from where they occur. So for California, what does this mean for California from the standpoint of what are our tsunami sources that we have to worry about? And this is a kind of a good picture of what California has its faults. The primary concern we have here is that you have two different types of plate tectonic boundaries that could impact the tsunami threat along the coast. In the north coast, we have the Cascadia subduction zone, and this is one of those areas that stretches from Cape Mendocino all the way to British Columbia. So we could get a very large earthquake, a great earthquake, a magnitude 9 earthquake that's generated by this fault, and have an immediate impact from a tsunami perspective on the coasts along this area, arriving in 10 to 30 minutes. So that's our largest threat in California. South of Cape Mendocino, the plate boundary is controlled by the San Andreas fault zone. And this is a type of fault that has a different type of mechanism in movement. It moves side to side or laterally, and it directly does not create large tsunamis along coastlines like this. So faults like this typically don't have large tsunamis, but they can generate landslides. And that's one concern we have. And then there are some other faults that are offshore that could displace have a vertical component to them in their motion during an earthquake. However, these have a pretty long return period, so they're not quite as much of a threat or a risk, if you look at it that way, over a long period of time. So the rest of our coastline really is facing more of a threat from distant source tsunamis. So from a distant source perspective, we still face a moderate to high hazard in many locations along our coast from these sources around the Pacific. The Tonga Kermadec Island area, that trench is one of those types of areas that we have to worry about. However, the most significant threat for California is really an earthquake, a great earthquake along the Alaska-Aleutian Islands subduction zone. And although it's difficult to tell from this figure, the tsunami sources offshore from Alaska and the Aleutian Islands generate the most direct wave energy towards California. Previous earthquakes from this region that occurred in 1946 and 1964 generated two of the three tsunamis that had significant inundation along the California coast over the last 200 years. So not only is this the highest hazard, but it also has the relatively short travel time, 4 hours to our north coast and 6 hours to our south coast. So this is really kind of a regional threat almost that we have to worry about. So we include in our mapping, in our hazard analysis, we include this region as one of the areas we model the most, but we do look at other sources from around the Pacific also. One of the primary events that we've responded to over the last 10 years has been the Tohoku tsunami from Japan. And so this is a really good video to show what a tsunami looks like when it's large and local and it affects the coastline immediately. And you can see here the tsunami is coming on shore with multiple sets of surges. Once it gets on shore, it picks up debris, it picks up sediment, and we're not really looking at pure water anymore. We're looking at a mud flow that's moving at a very fast rate, maybe 30 to 50 miles an hour in some cases onshore. And you can see just from the size of this, you can see the van that's there in the middle. It's a very large tsunami. Started at about 10 meters near the shoreline, and it's at this point we're probably a good mile inland, and it still has a lot of energy. But tsunamis, generally, there's two different things that can stop a tsunami, or where they kind of run out of gas, and one of them is when they have that, don't have that wave set up behind it to keep pushing the tsunami further inland, and it just basically runs out of momentum. Or you have a vertical structure, like here's an elevated road that helped prevent a lot of the Sendai Plain from getting inundated even further. So it backed up the tsunami at that point and protected a lot of areas inland. So definitely something you don't want to be in the middle of, and you can see how dangerous it is. So there have been a lot of different lessons that we've learned from Japan and other events over the last 10 years that I wanted to briefly talk about. In collaboration with our colleagues in Japan, we learned that before the 2011 event, they had created tsunami evacuation maps that were based on historical events over the past 100 to 500 years. However, geologic evidence, which are shown here with sand layers in between the mud layers that you see here in these cores, these represent different tsunamis over the past several thousand years. And they have, this does show that the 2011 event was one of these very large events that is similar to what it would be considered a 1,000-year event. So it should be noted, though, despite this fact, despite that they underestimated the size of the tsunami, they were still able to save at least 90% of the people within the tsunami inundation area. So that's a terrific number, and it really goes to the fact that they have really good education there when it comes to tsunamis. For California, what this indicated to us is that we need to consider something like a 1,000-year event as a minimum for our mapping. So, this is basically equivalent of a 5% chance of exceedance in 50 years. And we use that as a baseline now for a lot of our response mapping, and it pushed us into the realm of trying to develop probabilistic tsunami hazard analysis maps. The lessons we learned in California were a little different, but still very important. In California, our Tsunami Warning Center placed the northern 2/3 of our state into a warning level alert status, advising evacuations. And in the southern part of the state, we had one-third of our state that was in an advisory, which implied strong currents inside harbors. But overall, because the tides were low and the tsunami was pretty minor when it got to our coastline, we didn't see inundation of dry land in very many locations. But because of the uncertainty in what might be the expected flood potential, there were inconsistencies in response for our communities and our harbors. For harbors, it was unclear if, when, and where vessels should be moved. Boaters knew very little about how to respond to tsunamis. And for the long-term effects, recovery was an issue for a number of the harbors. For the communities, they only had two options for evacuation, either no evacuation or a full evacuation of their hazard area. So many of them didn't have enough information to make a call, and because they thought the tides were low, knew the tides were low and the tsunami was small, many of them did not call for evacuations. But we got lucky because of those, despite not being scientifically supported, we didn't have any impacts from that decision. But we needed to improve that in the future. So based on that experience, we've looked at developing scientifically based decision support products for secondary evacuation plans for distant source events, similar to what William showed for New Zealand. Some of the impacts that you can see here that we've learned for harbors is that you could get strong, unpredictable currents, eddies and whirlpools that affect the openings to a lot of the harbors, sudden water level fluctuations, debris in the water, amplified waves, scour, and the long-term environmental issues. We had similar types of impacts that we saw to communities and structures, especially from the Japanese. You know, there are just general impacts from flood waters that aren't moving very swiftly. Those are problematic. Sometimes it's about decision making, you know, what to do with evacuation. Should you call for an evacuation or not call? So that can be a hazard if they make the wrong call. And vulnerable populations exist within the zone. You know, you may get secondary earthquake hazards that affect evacuation. And then you have forces that on structures that you have to worry about. And similar to the harbors, you have these debris, scour, and long-term impacts from other issues. So as previously mentioned, in order to understand the potential recurrence of certain tsunami hazard levels and scenarios, we worked with AECOM to develop a detailed probabilistic analysis for all low-lying populated areas of our coast. And we have started to integrate this information into our new mapping products used for evacuation planning, land use planning, and design and construction of buildings. And it's also better to compare it makes it easier to compare specific hazards statewide. And that's what I've done here is I've just shown what a 1,000-year event would look like statewide and what the impacts along the coast. And they're pretty significant. For a 1,000-year event from Cascadia, we could see tsunami heights up to 70 feet in Crescent City, and Humboldt Bay also would get to close to 40 feet. As we go a little further south, we could see the impacts are more from the Alaska Aleutian subduction zone once we get south of Cape Mendocino. So we're seeing 20 to 30 feet along that part of the coast. Even inside the San Francisco Bay Area, we could expect to see tsunamis that could get up to 10 to 15 feet in the Alameda, which is directly across from the opening to the bay. And then it would dissipate as it goes north and south. But the second area that has the highest hazard is really from San Francisco south to Point Conception. And we see in certain locations that we get some pretty high tsunami run-ups from the modeling, up to 40 to 60 feet in some locations. Once we get south of Point Conception, the tsunami threat or hazard goes pretty far down. So it's almost half of what it is elsewhere, 10 to 15 foot range in different locations along the coast. So you can see here that not every place is the same, and even from a local to a distant threat, you can still get some significant tsunamis. Some of the products that we're developing, you know, this is kind of looping back to that disaster planning cycle, is that we have these hazard assessments that have been done from probabilistic analysis that can really help us in all different facets of our work, including the new hazard area maps that we're developing for evacuation planning and for the public. This information, we have about a third of the state that's released now. We just had a release 2 weeks ago. For a couple counties, but we're continuing to do that and hope to get that done by the end of the year. We also are developing secondary evacuation and response plans similar to what New Zealand have that show evacuations that could be staged or phased at different levels. And we call these playbooks, kind of a sports analogy, that these are defensive plays against the tsunami, which is on the offensive. We also are using our products to develop, integrate into the new building code requirements for essential and critical facilities, the tsunami design zones that have been developed in that, and we're updating that with our new maps. We also have work that's being done under the Seismic Hazard Act, which we'll talk about briefly. We're also integrating this into hazard or risk analysis for land use planning using the HAZUS risk tool, which they have a new tsunami risk tool that's available. And then last, we're also developing products that are helpful with tsunami, sediment and debris movement. And as I mentioned, last slide here, just that we're going forward with the Seismic Hazard Mapping Act and integrating tsunami zones into the act there that will help not only at a project level, which is the primary purpose of the act, but also at the community level by setting up a better mitigation strategy that includes evacuation, land use, and engineering options. And we hope to have some of these first maps out this next year. So thank you for your time. And anybody that wants to learn more about the tsunamis in California, please come and visit our website and take a look at our different products. And there's my email address if you have any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rick. I got so involved with these presentations, I didn't watch the time. We only have about 5 minutes left. And I want to thank both of our speakers today for excellent presentations. I enjoyed them and learned quite a bit. But I want to quickly go to Vulcan. We have time for a couple of questions, I hope. So Vulcan, could you take it away, please?
Yes, thank you, Bruce. So one question from Ian Aiken. He's asking, how long does these scenario calculations take? And can they be done on the fly? I think that was for William. He has shown few scenarios for us. And could you tell us about the logistics of the data processing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a trade-off between the level of detail and the speed of the calculation. So for our pre-calculated database, where time is not a constraint because we're doing them before the event, then we can go to quite a lot of detail, but it may take 24 hours to run each model, although of course we can run many of them simultaneously. If we want to run models in real time, we obviously need them to run more quickly than the tsunami actually takes place. And there are different options, but the simplest one is to reduce the level of detail. So we're not getting a fine-grained model of what's happening at small detail at the coast. And that's one way to speed it up. We can also use supercomputers or GPU computers as another way to try and accelerate things. We haven't got too far with that at the moment in New Zealand. We're mostly using pre-calculated or relatively coarse models.
Great. Quick follow-up. Do any of these scenarios or the database as a whole available to the public, or is just available to you guys?
It's an internal product to us
Okay.
and the civil defense authorities. Yeah.
All right. Maybe this is for Rick, and maybe William can also chime in as well. Do we have any web camera network to monitor events in real time? Or is this something that you are pushing and hoping that this will get funded some way? Who wants to take first? Maybe Rick first?
Yeah, I'll take part of that. Yeah, we've developed a network for the Pacific that are just basically free web cameras that are along the coast. We're trying to integrate other web cameras at the harbor level and the port level, because that's where we're seeing a lot of our tsunami activities. But we do have something like that we share with our constituents during an event, and if they want to use it, they can. I noticed that William did show one, so I'll let him continue the discussion there.
Yeah, we don't have a organized network of webcams. So the video I showed was from a member of the public. There are various webcams, often from surfing communities or towns that want to monitor their ports. So we can use what's available that's been installed for other reasons, but we haven't installed them deliberately for this purpose, although it's something we would certainly consider.
Quick follow-up, I guess, if you install them, somebody has to monitor them, right? Unless this is a post-disaster response. If you want to, so I wonder how would you be able to, if you have so many cameras, how would you be able to really monitor that unless you somewhat automate that process? Okay, so let me just check anything else.
Bruce Mason again. Vulcan,
Sure.
Just one more question. We're running a little bit over, but just one more, please.
Sure. This is from Tom Halser. I just want to ask this question. This is important. What do you visualize as worst tsunami scenarios for New Zealand and California? And I guess each of you can take this question.
Shall I start? So
Sure.
for us, the worst case would be a large earthquake, maybe around magnitude 9 or so on the Hikurangi subduction zone or the southern part of the Kermadec Trench. Also could be around magnitude 9. And these could be, you know, up to the scale of at the top end of the sort of thing we saw in the videos that Rick showed for Tohoku. So that's our kind of worst case.
Yeah, for us, we have two worst cases. One from a local source perspective would be Cascadia subduction zone. Just the size of the tsunami and the immediate impact on the community and the need to evacuate immediately from that local threat is paramount. For the rest of our coast, it's the Alaskan Aleutian Islands area, magnitude 9 to 9.3 earthquakes from that area tend to hit us the hardest. And so those are the ones we're most concerned about and we plan quite a bit for.
That's very good. I actually have one last question. I think it's important. In the buoy calculation, in the DART calculations, you have shown the maximum wave height, right? In the scenarios, I wonder, do you also take into account of the amount of duration that coast would be exposed to some level of wavelength?
Right.
Because that seems like a logical way of doing this.
Yes. So there are many different tools we can use for analyzing the DART pressure data. Some of the simpler ones may just look at the maximum amplitudes, but some of the more advanced ones that we're still working on implementing would indeed take into account the shape of the wave in terms of the duration. Typically those work by what we call an inversion process. So we try and match the wave that we see and use that to get a model of the tsunami source and use that for the forecast. So yes, we can include that.
Fantastic. But currently it isn't the case.
Well,
that's what I'm gathering.
PTWC would be making use of that information at the moment. And we're still building up our capabilities for doing that.
Perfect. Do you have something, Rick?
Yeah, just one thing, just kind of similar to that is the only way right now I think the warning centers have to actually cancel or, degrade a certain level is to look at the tide gauge readings along a coastline. So more tide gauges, the better, the more information that will help them determine what when the threat is lowered or gone away.
Fantastic. Well, I would like to thank everyone on behalf of our chapter and on behalf of Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. And thank you for participating. It was a fantastic talk.